You identify a turning point or a shift in South African foreign policy from a more normative perspective, which, if I understood correctly, prevailed in the Mandela government, to a more pragmatic one, which came in the following Mbeki government. And I was wondering while reading this, does presidential leadership has anything to do with this change? Does the fact that Mandela was the president, and Mandela is, as you know, is seen as a world hero, does this affect the country's foreign policy? Does it make it more normative? And then is Mbeki, but the fact that Mbeki became the president also made it more pragmatic, independently of structural or identity factors? And finally, the discussion on participation, I found it very interesting as well, and particularly the influence that COSATU, that the unions have. But I'm not convinced that low participation in foreign policy is related to the nature of South African democracy, as you put it, for the following reason. You know, again, and you said this as well, in most countries, the public has very low participation in foreign policy issues, and we were actually discussing this yesterday. Professor Maria Regina reminded us that, you know, in the exception of situations where there is war, the public is generally not involved in foreign policy issues. And I believe this would apply even to the United States. Right? When there's war involved, it's different, as this was the case in the last two elections. But otherwise, and in general, the public has very low participation in foreign policy, even during election periods. And so if this is the case, then, and obviously these countries have very different political systems, very different democracies, so to speak, then it's not the particular nature of South African democracy that explains the low participation. It might explain perhaps the quality of this participation or the composition, but not the low participation in itself. How am I doing on time?
10 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. That's perfect. That's a half. Okay, so I'll stop here with my comments towards Dr. Smith's paper, and I'll move on to the Chinese presentation by Dr. Ziming Chen. Like I said, it does not deal with foreign policy directly, but it deals with issues that have a bearing, arguably, on foreign policy. And, okay, let me start by the way you put it in your presentation rather than in your paper, and the way that you started here, actually a very, very high-tech presentation in itself, and I appreciated the special effects. You know, you seem to suggest implicitly that a war between China and the U.S. is at least likely, right? As China becomes a superpower, this is an assumption that you adopt in your work, but you don't really discuss it. And obviously, it follows a hardcore realist position, I would say. But you don't mention, at least not in your paper, you did mention here in your presentation for a short while, the issue of deterrence, right? And this issue is very closely linked to nuclear weapons, which both countries possess. But this you don't discuss in your paper either, the issue of nukes. You mention it very quickly and in passing, but you do not elaborate it. So my first reaction would be, why wouldn't deterrence work? It worked with the Soviet Union. If China is the next superpower and it also has nuclear weapons, why should we worry about the possibility of war with the United States? And shouldn't the issue of nuclear weapons be more prominently approached in the Chinese strategy or security approach towards the U.S.? In particular, is there not second strike capability in China? And you didn't say it with these words, but from your presentation, I assume that there is. I don't know exactly how many nuclear devices China has. I guess about 20 or so, if it hasn't grown more than that. And that, you know, depending on how you deploy them, you certainly could give China second strike capabilities, which in turn, according to theory, or at least neo-realist theory, would lead us to expect that deterrence would work, and that war is not likely. China could defend itself with nukes. It doesn't need necessarily to resort to all other measures. Okay. I don't find the Hardman argument convincing. As you mentioned, it's been endorsed by several authors, Mackinder and Brzezinski, and again, just to recapitulate, the argument is that whoever dominates that big chunk of land in Eurasia would have a great strategic advantage, and according to some would dominate the world because it could be protected and it would be very difficult to invade. But, you know, this precise area of the globe has been invaded at least 3 times in modern history. Napoleon in the 2 world wars. So, not to mention that in an age where you have airplanes, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and all of the devices that you mentioned, you know, that China can intercept missiles in the stratosphere, geography, the land in particular, is not that relevant as a strategic or security asset. Okay, I have 5 minutes. I'll very quickly just talk a little bit about the discussion of power. I found, well, actually it's not me, it's the entire literature in IR finds and treats power as a very problematic concept. There's no widely agreed upon definition. It's very different from the core concept of economics, which is money, in the sense that it cannot be as easily measured, and it's certainly not as fungible. And you discuss measures of power, but you don't really discuss the concept of power. And, you know, what are we trying to measure, really? Is it influence? It's very context dependent, and this comes through in your discussion very nicely. Most of the approaches that you present, and particularly the Western ones, I must say, they're very positivist. Though China follows more or less in the same lines from what I can measure. In the sense that you can a priori define, measure, and even predict levels of power. I find that very problematic. I'm skeptical about the utility of such efforts. And finally, towards your conclusion, you say, you know, that the U.S. is dependent on information, and this makes it vulnerable, right? And so Chinese strategy would be precisely to undermine the information systems that guides not only the U.S. military, but also the U.S. economy. Yet, the Chinese strategy in itself is also based on information and on high-tech, cybernetics, and the like. So, and maybe I didn't understand your argument correctly, but why would it make the U.S. vulnerable and not China? Or why would China follow the same path as the U.S. if it perceives the dependence on all this information systems, technology and communication informations, as making the country vulnerable to an outside attack? And then there's the issue of preemption, which you said is also part of the Chinese strategy, and is also, I think, very problematic, because what would you be preempting by a strike like that? Or how would you know when to attack? It's not an easy issue. But I'll stop here, and I look forward to your answers. Thank you.